The HOA thought they could bully one farmer into quiet submission. What they didn't know was that the man standing in their way wasn't just a farmer. He was Cornell Braxton, director of the FAA, and he was about to bring their entire scheme crashing down. The sound of bulldozers wasn't supposed to echo across the quiet fields of Durham County, North Carolina that morning. Yet there it was. Engines snarling, steel tracks chewing through soft earth, metal teeth clawing at the ground as if the land had no memory, no voice, no bloodline. The construction crew marched forward in bright neon vests and heavy boots, their faces blank, their movements mechanical. To them, it was just another contract, another paycheck. None of them cared that this field wasn't just dirt. To them, it was an empty canvas. To Cornell Braxton, it was the soul of his family. From the edge of his soybean field, Cornell stood like a storm waiting to break. He didn't shout. He didn't wave his arms. He didn't need to. At 6 feet tall, with shoulders carved by years of farm work, and a presence that turned heads even in silence, he carried a quiet authority that made people pause. His worn jeans bore the stains of honest labor. His faded work shirt clung to muscles earned, not bought. He gripped the brim of his cap with the kind of control that hinted just how close he was to letting rage spill over. Behind him, his father's old barn sat weathered but unbroken, its red paint faded to a weary rust. That barn wasn't just lumber. That soil wasn't just soil. It was Braxton history, 3 generations worth of sweat, survival, and sacrifice woven into every acre. A foreman spotted him and gave a forced wave. "Morning, sir. Just a heads up. We'll be clearing a strip right through here. We got the green light." Cornell's eyes narrowed, his voice cutting sharp over the grind of the machinery. "This isn't HOA property. This is my farm. You're trespassing." The foreman's confidence faltered. He glanced over his shoulder at the bulldozers crawling forward, then back at Cornell. "I don't make the rules. Talk to your board. We've got the permits." "Permits don't mean a thing if they're built on stolen ground," Cornell shot back, his tone steady but burning. By then, Rosalind Braxton, his younger sister, came rushing from the southern fence line. Her apron was dusted white with flour, her hands sticky with half-kneaded dough she'd abandoned mid-rise. Her eyes widened at the sight of the tearing machines. "Cornell, what on earth is happening? They think they can put a runway through Braxton land." His reply was flat, but the steel under it made her spine stiffen. Rosalind turned toward the machines, her jaw tightening, anger flushing through her disbelief. "They've lost their minds!" The foreman shifted, lowering his voice now, almost pleading. "Look, sir, I've got orders. You've got a problem? Take it up with the HOA president, Geraldine Klein. She signed off on this. I can't stop the work." Cornell drew in a long breath, nostrils flaring, every muscle wound tight like a coiled spring. He held it, forcing himself calm, but his eyes never left the machines that dared to chew into Braxton land. Cornell didn't shout, he didn't storm, he didn't throw a fit. Instead, he moved with a slow, deliberate calm that made the foreman's throat go dry. He brushed past him without a word and walked straight toward the bulldozer. The ground seemed to tremble under its grinding weight. Cornell raised one hand. The operator inside the cab blinked, confused, until Cornell's eyes locked onto his. That look carried no threats, no begging, just raw, immovable authority. The operator hesitated, then, almost against his own will, cut the engine. The sudden silence hit the field like a stage curtain crashing down after chaos. The growl of machines gave way to an eerie stillness. Every bird call, every rustle of leaves seemed louder now. "Not one more inch," Cornell said, his voice low but resonant enough to slice through the quiet. The crew froze. These men had dealt with angry homeowners before. Shouts, legal papers waved in trembling hands, even threats of lawsuits. But Cornell Braxton wasn't just another furious landowner. He carried himself like a man who didn't need to yell to be obeyed. By then, a small crowd had begun to gather at the property line. Neighbors in joggers and bathrobes whispered about the project. The HOA had sold them a dream, a private airstrip that would elevate property values and attract the right kind of neighbors. Some nodded approvingly, others shifted uncomfortably as reality dawned. This wasn't empty land being carved apart. It was Braxton land. Rosalind rushed to her brother's side, tugging at his sleeve with flour-dusted fingers. Her voice trembled with urgency. "Cornell, you need to handle this through the county. Don't give them a reason to twist this against you." "I'll handle it," he replied, his tone calm, but his eyes burned with resolve. What none of the crew, none of the gawking neighbors, and not even Rosalind knew was that Cornell's life stretched far beyond this farm. The fields kept him rooted. The soil was his anchor. But during the week, he was on planes to Washington, sitting in polished offices that oversaw the skies of the entire nation. Cornell Braxton wasn't just a farmer. He was the director of the Federal Aviation Administration. And here stood an HOA, tearing scars across his land to build a runway that could never fly without his signature. The air thickened as a sleek black SUV rolled to a stop at the edge of the field. Out stepped Geraldine Klein, HOA president, wrapped in tailored power and arrogance. Her designer heels sank into the dirt, her perfume cutting sharply against the scent of churned earth. She slid off her sunglasses, letting them dangle from manicured fingers as she strode toward Cornell like she already owned him and the land beneath his boots. "Mr. Braxton," she called smoothly, her tone rehearsed. "I see you've met the crew. You'll be glad to know this project will raise everyone's property values. It's progress." Cornell didn't move, didn't flinch. "You mean it's theft? This ground isn't HOA property. It's mine." Geraldine's lips curved into a cold corporate smile, the kind of smile that came with boardroom victories and bulldozed dissent. "Our records say otherwise. The board approved this unanimously." "Resistance will only make things harder for you in the long run," Rosalind gasped, anger flashing in her eyes. "Harder for him? Geraldine, you're bulldozing family land." Geraldine didn't even glance at her. Her eyes stayed locked on Cornell, as though Rosalind was a gust of wind not worth acknowledging. Cornell studied Geraldine for a long, silent moment. Then his words landed like a hammer. "You've built your fight on the wrong runway." For the first time, Geraldine's smile cracked, the veneer slipping just slightly. She couldn't have known that the man standing in front of her had the power to ground her entire project before it ever left the dirt. But now it wasn't just about land. It was about pride, power, a collision course that no one in Maplewood Lakes could avoid. Even after the bulldozers went still, Cornell didn't retreat to his farmhouse. He stayed at the edge of the field, hands on his hips, staring at the gouges carved into his soil. Each groove was a wound, each scar a reminder of the fight that had just begun. The sun climbed higher, burning away the haze, but Cornell's mind was already elsewhere, shifting gears, calculating moves. For anyone else, this might have been a property dispute. For him, this was war, layered with history, politics, and skies only he controlled. That evening, as the crickets began their steady chorus outside, the Braxton farmhouse glowed with soft lamplight. Cornell sat at the worn oak table that had seen decades of family meals, his elbows heavy on the scarred surface. The faint aroma of Rosalind's fresh bread still lingered in the kitchen, comforting yet bittersweet after the chaos of the day. Across from him sat his wife, Patrice Braxton. She had driven back from Raleigh after a long day teaching middle school history. Her blouse still smelled faintly of chalk and the perfume she wore to command a noisy classroom. She set a steaming mug of coffee in front of him, then leaned in, studying his face the way she studied her students when they tried to hide the truth. "You didn't tell them who you are, did you?" Patrice's voice was quiet but edged with worry. Cornell shook his head, his fingers tracing the rim of his mug. "No, that part comes later." Patrice arched a brow. "You sure about that? You're the director of the FAA, Cornell. You could have shut the whole thing down on the spot." "That's not how this works," he said, rubbing the hardened calluses on his palms. "This isn't about throwing weight around, it's about respect. They need to learn that first." From the corner, their son Anthony, 22, slouched on a chair, phone glowing in his hands. He was home for the summer after another semester of college debates and endless opinions. Without looking up, he muttered, "Dad, they don't care about respect. HOA folks like that, they think they own the county." "Mom's right. You could end this tomorrow if you wanted to." Cornell's lips curved into a small smile, though his eyes stayed fixed on the steam rising from his mug. "Anthony, sometimes the loudest power isn't the one you slam on the table. It's the one you keep in your back pocket until the moment's right." Anthony finally glanced up, unimpressed. "Sounds like you're just letting them push you around." Patrice shot her son a sharp look. "Anthony." But Cornell didn't take offense. He'd been called worse, on Capitol Hill, in federal hearings, in rooms where tempers boiled hotter than this kitchen ever could. He turned his gaze directly to his son, steady and instructive. "Let me ask you something. If you fight every battle with a hammer, what happens when you come across a problem that needs a scalpel? You'll wreck the whole thing. Sometimes you wait. Sometimes you let them show you just how reckless they are. That way, when you strike, it's clean." The room fell into a thoughtful quiet. Anthony shifted uncomfortably but didn't roll his eyes this time. He gave a slow nod, the lesson settling in, even if pride kept him from saying it aloud. Patrice reached across the table and laced her fingers with Cornell's. Her voice softened, almost pleading. "I just don't want them dragging your name through the mud. You know they'll twist this however they can." Cornell squeezed her hand, eyes burning with a resolve that made her heart steady. "They've already started digging in the mud," he said, his tone low and dangerous. "They just don't realize whose land they're sinking into." The next morning, before sunrise painted the fields gold, Cornell was already gone. He carried nothing but a plain duffel bag dressed in simple clothes. No suits, no fanfare, just a man on his way to work. But behind the wheel, his mind was sharp, already weighing every angle. Policy briefings, aviation safety reports, federal approvals, stacks of paperwork on his desk in Washington that had the power to ground Geraldine Klein's dream runway before it ever saw daylight. By noon, Cornell Braxton sat in his office at FAA headquarters, the tall glass windows framing a commanding view of the U.S. Capitol. The contrast was stark. Yesterday, he had been standing in worn boots on family soil. Today, polished staffers moved briskly through hallways, dropping folders and updates on his desk. Here, in the heart of federal power, he wasn't Farmer Braxton. He was Director Braxton, the man whose signature shaped the very skies above the nation. He spoke sparingly, but with precision. Colleagues leaned in when he gave direction, aware of the quiet authority he carried. At one point, his deputy, Franklin Yates, a sharp but loyal right hand, leaned into his office with a respectful knock. "Sir, you've got the Aviation Committee briefing at 3. Cornell nodded, his gaze fixed on the Capitol dome gleaming in the distance. The HOA had no idea. They thought they were building a runway. What they didn't know was that they were standing directly in his airspace. "You ready?" Franklin asked, leaning on the doorframe of Cornell's office. Cornell closed the thick folder of aviation reports and looked up, calm but deliberate. "I was born ready. But let me ask you something, Franklin. What's the FAA's official stance on unapproved private runways built over disputed land?" Franklin blinked, caught off guard by the oddly specific question. "Illegal, plain and simple. You need permits, environmental clearances, airspace studies, proof of land ownership, the works. Why?" Cornell's mouth curved into that faint smile only his closest staff recognized. The kind of smile that meant he was already 5 steps ahead. "Let's just say he murmured. "I have a personal interest in how the rules are applied." Back in Maplewood Lakes, the war drums beat louder. Inside the HOA clubhouse, a polished building with stone columns, manicured hedges, and the smug aura of exclusivity, Geraldine Klein presided over her board like a queen over a court. She sipped sparkling water from a crystal glass, every movement measured for effect. "Neighbors," she began, voice smooth and commanding, "the runway project is moving forward. Don't let Braxton scare you. He's just one man standing in the way of progress. We've dealt with stubborn landowners before." The board members flanking her shifted in their seats. Travis Merriman, the youngest of the group, cleared his throat nervously. "With all due respect, Geraldine, Braxton isn't just any landowner. Folks say he's got pull beyond this county. What if he takes this to court?" Geraldine waved a manicured hand as though brushing away a gnat. "Courts take years, Travis. By then, the runway will be operational. And when property values double, people will thank us. Trust me." But whispers had already spread through Maplewood Lakes. In the grocery store aisles, on church steps, even outside the elementary school playground, neighbors muttered whether Geraldine had gone too far this time. The Braxton name carried weight. People remembered how Cornell's father had fought through drought and debt to keep the farm alive. They remembered Rosalind's years teaching Sunday school. They remembered Cornell, quiet, private, but always dignified. And for the first time, doubt began to chip at Geraldine's polished veneer. By the week's end, Maplewood Lakes had split into two camps. Flyers appeared in mailboxes urging support for the HOA's vision. Construction crews returned with survey stakes and fresh machinery, ignoring the gathering crowds at the Braxton fence line. The farm had become a spectacle, a place where whispers grew louder than diesel engines. On Saturday morning, the HOA staged its most brazen move yet, a special meeting in the clubhouse. By noon, the hall was packed. Retirees in pastel polos, young couples juggling restless toddlers, longtime residents who had lived through county booms and busts, all squeezed into rows of folding chairs. The air buzzed with curiosity, irritation, and rumor. At the front, Geraldine stood tall behind the podium in a sharp navy suit, hair pulled into a flawless knot. She looked less like an HOA president and more like a candidate running for office. Beside her sat Travis Merriman and Evelyn Rhodes, both visibly uneasy. Geraldine tapped the microphone, her smile wide and practiced. "Thank you, everyone, for coming on such short notice. We are here to address concerns about the runway project and to reassure you that everything is moving ahead as planned. This development will raise property values, attract high-quality residents, and bring Maplewood Lakes into the future." Murmurs rippled across the room. From the back, a man's voice rang out. "And whose land are you plowing through for this future? Because last I checked, that farm belongs to the Braxton family." Geraldine's smile tightened like a mask. "The land in question falls under Maplewood Lakes jurisdiction. Records show it was improperly filed years ago. The board's approval makes this development legitimate." A woman in the middle row shot to her feet. Joanne Fields, a 20-year resident with steel in her spine. "That's nonsense, Geraldine. Everyone in this county knows that land belongs to Cornell. His daddy worked it before him, and his grandfather before that. How dare you say it's yours to take?" Geraldine leaned into the microphone, her voice clipped and cold. "Joanne, emotion does not change facts. The Braxton family has been allowed to use the land out of courtesy. Legal jurisdiction rests with Maplewood Lakes. The board has approved the project. End of discussion." And that's when the back doors creaked open. Cornell Braxton stepped inside. He didn't thunder in. He didn't wave papers or shout. He simply entered the room in his worn work clothes, cap tucked respectfully under his arm, boots still carrying the dust of his fields. Yet the weight of his presence shifted the air. Conversations faltered, heads turned. He didn't need to announce himself. Everyone already knew, and Geraldine Klein's confident smile wavered for the first time. The room fell into a hush as Cornell crossed the floor, his boots striking against the hardwood like a slow drum beat. He removed his cap, tucking it under his arm, and without asking permission, took an empty chair in the front row. Geraldine's polished smile faltered. "Mr. Braxton," she said, her tone clipped but carrying a tremor. "We weren't expecting you." Cornell's voice was calm, but every syllable carried authority. "I wasn't expecting bulldozers on my land either, yet here we are." The crowd stirred with whispers, shifting uneasily in their folding chairs. Geraldine quickly straightened her shoulders, gesturing broadly to the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is exactly what I've been saying. Progress comes with resistance. We cannot let one man stand in the way of what benefits everyone." Cornell leaned forward, resting his calloused hands on his knees. "That's the thing, Geraldine. You keep saying everyone, but when you talk about progress, you mean profit for a handful of investors and destruction for the rest. My family's land isn't some bargaining chip for your ambition." Beside her, Travis Merriman shifted nervously, his face pale. He cleared his throat, voice wavering. Maybe we should slow down, Geraldine. People are upset. The Braxtons have a rightful claim." Geraldine's eyes snapped toward him, sharp as glass. "Travis, the board voted unanimously. You agreed. Don't backpedal now." The tension thickened, pressing on every chest in the room. Cornell rose slowly, his frame towering, his voice measured yet cutting like steel. "You've mistaken my patience for weakness. So let me be clear. The land is not yours, and every inch of dirt you tear up is one more inch you'll answer for." A ripple moved through the crowd, low murmurs, some nodding in support, others exchanging anxious looks. Families hadn't come to Maplewood Lakes for lawsuits, and the whisper of federal trouble hung heavy in the air. From the back, Howard Greer, an older resident with a weathered cane, stood shakily and lifted it toward the podium. His voice rasped but carried. "Geraldine, you've gone too far this time. I've paid HOA dues for 20 years, and not once have I seen you run roughshod over a man's property like this. You're courting disaster." The room broke into scattered applause. Geraldine's face reddened. She raised her hands, trying to corral the chaos. "Please, everyone, listen. This project has been thoroughly researched. The benefits outweigh the challenges." Cornell let out a short, sharp laugh. Not mocking, deadly certain. "You call trespassing a challenge? You've built your dream runway on stolen ground, and you think paperwork will protect you? Trust me, it won't fly." Gasps rolled through the hall. The phrase hung in the air like a verdict. Geraldine's voice cracked, her control slipping. Are you threatening the board, Mr. Braxton?" Cornell didn't blink. "No, I'm telling you a fact. There's a difference." The room erupted. Neighbors argued openly. Board members leaned in, whispering frantically. Geraldine pounded the gavel again and again, but each strike sounded weaker, more desperate. The meeting had unraveled. The illusion of unity shattered in front of the very community she claimed to lead. By the time people filtered out into the parking lot, the lines were clear. Geraldine and her allies on one side, Cornell and his quiet but unshakable resolve on the other. But Geraldine didn't yet understand the storm she had walked into. Cornell Braxton wasn't just a landowner. He was a man whose reach stretched far beyond Maplewood Lakes, and she had just drawn him into a fight on his terms. The following days turned the town into a pressure cooker. Conversations died when board members walked into the diner. Church potlucks turned into whispered debates. At the post office, neighbors exchanged looks instead of words. The Braxton farm became the community's uneasy compass. Its fields worked at dawn, its fences repaired by noon, its patriarch moving like always, but with shoulders carrying a heavier weight. Rosalind noticed it most. The way Cornell lingered at the horizon each evening, staring toward the machinery rumbling on the other side of the fence line. To others, it looked like a man keeping busy. To her, It was the look of someone sharpening a blade you couldn't see yet. One afternoon, as Cornell heaved another hay bale onto the trailer, the creak of gravel caught his ear. A dusty pickup rolled to a stop by the fence. Wesley Grant, a grease-stained mechanic who had lived 2 roads over for years, climbed out and tipped his hat. "Cornell," he called, voice low. "Mind if I have a word?" Cornell set the bale down, wiped his palms on his jeans, and nodded. "Go ahead." Wesley glanced around like a man afraid the wind itself might carry his words. "I don't like what Geraldine's doing. None of us do. But folks are scared. She's telling people if they fight her, they'll drag the whole neighborhood into lawsuits. Property values tank. Banks pull out. People believe her." Cornell's eyes held him steady. "And what do you believe, Wesley?" The mechanic's jaw flexed. "I believe land is land. Yours is yours. You don't take a man as soil unless you are ready to answer for it. But I've got kids, Cornell. If this turns into lawyers and court fees, I can't afford to be caught in the middle." Cornell nodded slowly, voice quiet but solid as bedrock. "I hear you. Nobody should have to pick between right and ruin. That weight isn't yours to carry. That's on her." Wesley shifted, uneasy, then muttered, "Just watch your back. Geraldine's not the type to back down. She'll double down." He was right. That evening, Geraldine proved it. A glossy, full-color newsletter landed in every Maplewood Lakes mailbox. Her words dripped with polish, promising prosperity, economic growth, exclusivity, a modern future. But the section about the Braxton farm cut like a knife. The land in question is under Maplewood Lakes jurisdiction and has been misused for decades. Current occupants have no rightful claim. At the Braxton kitchen table, Rosalind's hands trembled with rage as she slammed the paper down. "Misused?" she barked. "Your daddy bled into that soil, Cornell. Misused. They wouldn't know hard work if it bit them." Cornell read the lines without flinching. His silence was louder than anger. He folded the newsletter neatly, set it aside, and looked past it as if it were nothing more than trash. Patrice walked in from school, her satchel still on her shoulder. She scanned their faces, then the paper. "This is how they'll win, Cornell. They're controlling the story. If people swallow their version, you'll look like the troublemaker." Cornell leaned back, voice even. "That's why patience matters. Let them talk, let them lie. Every move they make digs their hole deeper. Eventually, they'll bury themselves." But while Cornell carried patience, the rest of the town did not. At Sunday service, St. Mark's pews buzzed with whispers before the choir even struck a chord. Afterward, in the sunlit parking lot, Geraldine played her part to perfection. She drifted toward a circle of congregants, smile polished, tones syrup sweet. "We should all pray for Mr. Braxton," she said, just loud enough for his niece to hear. "Change is hard for some people, but progress doesn't wait for sentimentality." The remark spread like wildfire. By Monday, Cornell was hearing secondhand how Geraldine painted him as stubborn, outdated, selfish. And worse, her board had marched into the county registrar's office, filing paperwork to formalize their claim. Edna Wilcox, the registrar, picked up her phone and called Cornell herself. "Mr. Braxton, I can't stop them from filing," she said in her gentle drawl. "But I thought you should know. They're trying to push this through fast." "Thank you, Edna," Cornell replied. His voice was steady. "I'll handle it." That night, cicadas hummed across the fields as Cornell and Patrice sat on the porch. He stared into the dark silhouette of his land, his voice barely above the drone. "They think this is about property lines. They don't realize it's about legacy. They think paperwork wins. They don't understand the law runs deeper than any HOA vote." Patrice touched his arm, eyes searching. "Then show them, Cornell. Don't wait too long." His gaze never left the fields. Timing is everything. Geraldine hasn't learned who she's really dealing with. The very next morning, Heavy machinery rolled closer to the Braxton boundary. Crews planted stakes, marking the earth as if it already belonged to them. Engines growled, steel teeth ready to cut scars across generations of soil. From porches and driveways, neighbors watched, hesitant, torn between fear of Geraldine's power and quiet loyalty to Cornell. For weeks, their silence had been a shield, but as those markers drove into the dirt, every witness knew it. Silence would not be enough. And Cornell, steady as ever, knew the moment had come to draw a line so sharp, the whole of Maplewood Lakes would have no choice but to see it. By Tuesday morning, the growl of diesel engines was impossible to ignore. Crews hammered new stakes into the soil with metallic thuds, each one a warning shot across the Braxton boundary. Cornell had spoken little since the HOA meeting. His quiet wasn't surrender, it was calculation. And now, the moment had come. Rosalind stormed into the yard, clutching another envelope. Her voice was hot with outrage. "Cornell, they're threatening fines. Can you believe that? Fines for obstructing their project on your own land." Cornell took the paper, read it once, and folded it with steady hands. "Then it's time they hear me plain." He dialed Franklin Yates in his D.C. office. His tone was calm, deliberate. "Franklin, I'll need full FAA documentation on private airstrips, approvals, permits, environmental clearances, everything, the works." There was a pause on the line. Franklin's voice lowered. "Cornell, is this personal?" "It's legal," Cornell replied, his eyes fixed on the scarred horizon. "And it's about to get public." By late afternoon, word had spread like fire in dry grass. Cornell Braxton wasn't just attending the next HOA board session. He was speaking formally, on the record. The clubhouse swelled beyond capacity, neighbors crammed shoulder to shoulder, some standing in the aisles, others pressed against the walls. The air buzzed with anticipation. At the front, Geraldine Klein sat at the head of the long table, flanked by her board. Her navy suit was razor-sharp, her pearl necklace gleaming beneath the fluorescent lights. She banged the gavel with crisp authority. "This meeting is in session." From the audience, Cornell rose. No papers, no notes, just his presence. Every eye followed as he walked to the front and turned to face her. "You've trespassed on my family's farm. You've sent crews onto land that isn't yours. And now you've threatened fines." His voice carried, low but unshakable. "Let me make myself clear. That land is legally mine, documented, recorded. Your claim is false." Geraldine leaned back, her smile thin as a blade. "Mr. Braxton, the board has reviewed the records. The land was absorbed into Maplewood Lakes years ago. Our decision stands." Cornell didn't blink. He stepped closer, his words echoing in the packed room. "You keep talking about records. Then maybe you should know who keeps the records that matter." The pause was electric. "I'm Cornell Braxton, Director of the Federal Aviation Administration. And I'm telling you now, no runway gets built in this country without my signature. Certainly not on stolen land." The room exploded in gasps and whispers. Neighbors turned to each other, murmuring in disbelief. Some gaped, others nodded fiercely, as though a hidden truth had just snapped into place. At the table, Travis Merriman shifted uneasily, his face pale. He glanced at Geraldine as if begging her for direction. For the briefest second, Geraldine froze. Her mask slipped, her confidence cracking. She recovered with a strained laugh, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her. "That's quite a claim, Mr. Braxton. Surely you wouldn't use your federal position to interfere in a simple community project." Cornell's gaze never wavered. His tone dropped into steel. "Interfere? No. Enforce? Absolutely. Dream about your runway all you want, Geraldine. But without FAA approval, your strip of asphalt will be nothing more than an illegal hazard. And the penalties for operating without clearance." He leaned forward just slightly, his presence filling the room. "Are not something you're prepared to handle." Silence thundered through the clubhouse. Geraldine's knuckles whitened around her gavel. The crowd knew this was no longer a neighborhood spat. This was a collision of power, pride, and federal law, and Geraldine Klein had just run her bulldozer straight into a wall named Cornell Braxton. The room buzzed with anxious energy, whispers colliding like static before Joan Fields suddenly rose from the audience, her voice slicing through the air like a whip. "You see, Geraldine, you've been bullying everyone into believing you had the power. But you don't. You picked a fight with the wrong man." Gasps rippled across the hall. Joan, usually soft-spoken, stood tall now, her hands trembling but her eyes blazing with fury. Howard Greer, old but sharp as broken glass, leaned on his cane and tapped it against the wooden floor for emphasis. "I told you this would backfire. You can steal a man's land and expect him to roll over like some whipped dog." Geraldine's face flushed crimson, but her smile stayed plastered on, tight and brittle. "Neighbors," she declared, "don't be swayed by theatrics. This is about progress." Cornell finally rose to his full height, every eye swinging to him. His presence filled the room, broad shoulders, calm but unbreakable. "No, Geraldine," he said, his voice steady but cutting deep. "This is about arrogance. You thought the rules didn't apply to you, but rules apply to everyone, whether you're a farmer, a neighbor, or a board president. And you've crossed the line." The silence that followed was suffocating. Feet shifted nervously. Someone coughed. Even Evelyn Rhodes, usually Geraldine's staunchest ally, leaned in and whispered urgently in her ear, "We need to reconsider. This isn't worth it." But Geraldine's pride wouldn't allow her to bend. Her chin lifted and she said stiffly, "We'll consult legal counsel. This matter is not finished." Cornell gave a single nod, the kind that carried the weight of finality. "Then I'll see you in court, and in Washington." With that, he turned and walked out, unshaken, his shoulders squared like a man carrying both history and destiny. The crowd parted instinctively, some neighbors patting his arm in quiet solidarity, others staring at him with something close to awe. Outside, Rosalind rushed to his side, her apron still streaked with flour. "Cornell," she whispered, breathless, "you just put the fear of God in that woman." Cornell allowed the faintest of smiles. "Sometimes the truth does the work for you." But Patricia's warning from earlier echoed in his head. This wasn't over. Geraldine wasn't the type to surrender. If she doubled down, the fight could drag every neighbor into the mud. By Wednesday morning, Maplewood Lakes was a firestorm. On every porch, at every kitchen table, on every buzzing text thread, the same question surfaced. What happens now? Families who had moved to the neighborhood chasing quiet and safety suddenly found themselves staring down lawsuits, federal oversight, and collapsing property values. The dream of the perfect subdivision, the pond, the tidy lawns, the clubhouse, was cracking under the weight of Geraldine's pride and Cornell's defiance. At the corner lot, Angela Rowe, a single mother with 2 kids, slammed her coffee mug on the porch rail. "I don't care about no runway. I can barely make my mortgage as it is. Now Geraldine's talking about lawyers? And lawyers mean money. Whose pockets do you think that's coming from? Ours." Her neighbor Clint Peterson shook his head grimly. "She's playing with fire. Cornell's got the law and the FAA. She's dragging us into a fight we can't win." Inside the clubhouse, Geraldine convened a closed-door strategy session. The blinds were drawn, the air thick with tension. Travis Merriman, usually her lapdog, cleared his throat nervously. "Geraldine, you heard him. He's not bluffing. If this goes federal, it's not just Cornell you're up against, it's Washington. And they don't lose." The room froze. Geraldine's hands trembled slightly as she gripped her folder, but she pressed her lips together and refused to let them see fear. For Geraldine Klein, surrender wasn't an option. "He's the FAA director," Travis said, his voice trembling despite his best efforts to sound firm. "He doesn't just have influence. He has authority. If he says no runway, there is no runway. Period. Geraldine's jaw tightened, eyes flashing with stubborn pride. Travis? You think I'm afraid of titles? He's bluffing. He won't risk using federal power for personal matters. We keep going. Evelyn Rhodes leaned forward, fingers interlaced so tightly they turned white. But what about the neighbors? They're turning against us. I've gotten 6 emails just today demanding we halt the project. People are scared. Fear is temporary, Geraldine snapped, her voice like a whip. Progress is permanent. Once the runway is finished, they'll thank us. But outside those closed blinds, patience in Maplewood Lakes was running dry. That evening, several families trudged up the gravel path to the Braxton property. They weren't there to cheer Cornell on or throw stones at Geraldine. They came seeking clarity, desperate for someone to steady the ground beneath their feet. Angela Rowe spoke first, worry lining her tired face. Mr. Braxton, we don't want no trouble, but this mess gets bigger every day. What happens to us if this goes to court? Cornell set down the hammer he'd been using to mend a fence post and gave her his full attention. His voice was steady, grounded, not a politician's rehearsed speech, but the truth of a man rooted in the soil beneath his boots. Angela, he said, you didn't start this fight, neither did your neighbors. Geraldine forced it by crossing a line. I'm not here to hurt you or anyone else. I'm here to protect what's mine. And the truth is the law is on my side. If it goes to court, she'll lose, not you. Wesley Grant scratched his beard, his brow furrowed. But she's making it sound like we're all liable, like the HOA can bleed us dry with legal fees. Cornell gave a single nod. That's her tactic, fear, scare people into silence. But HOA boards aren't above the law. She doesn't have the power to bankrupt this community over her vanity project. And if she tries, she'll answer for that too. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. Relief for some, lingering worry for others. Then, from the back, a teenage boy beside his father raised his hand timidly. Mr. Braxton, why don't you just use your job to stop her? Wouldn't that be faster? Cornell crouched slightly, meeting the boy's eyes. Because, son, power isn't meant to be abused. If I swing my authority like a hammer every time I'm angry, then I'm no better than the people who take what isn't theirs. Sometimes, the lesson has to come the hard way, because when it does, it lasts longer. The boy nodded slowly, his father placing a firm hand on his shoulder. Families trickled away, a little calmer, a little braver than when they'd arrived. As the last neighbor left, Patricia joined Cornell by the fence, her voice quiet but admiring. You gave them calm. That's what they needed. Cornell exhaled, gaze fixed on the darkening horizon. They deserve calm, but Geraldine won't stop. She'll keep pushing until she breaks something. He was right. The very next morning, Geraldine escalated her war. A letter, printed in bold type, landed in every mailbox in Maplewood Lakes. Anyone supporting Cornell Braxton is obstructing community progress, it read. Non-compliance with HOA directives may result in fines or legal action. The words were sharp, threatening, crafted to divide neighbor against neighbor. But instead of cementing her power, the letter detonated like a grenade. At the local diner that evening, Joanne Fields slammed the letter onto the counter, her voice ringing through the booths. Who does she think she is? I didn't move here to bankroll her pet project. If she thinks she can bully the Braxtons and scare the rest of us, she's lost her grip. Heads nodded, voices rose. What Geraldine had intended as intimidation had become gasoline on the fire. Even Travis, once her loyal defender, was seen outside the clubhouse whispering with Evelyn. We're losing the neighborhood, he muttered, defeat in his voice. She's gone too far. People don't trust us anymore. The pristine mask of Maplewood Lakes was cracking. Lawn parties turned into whispered strategy sessions. Sunday greetings soured into tense silences. The HOA, once the symbol of order, had become the face of chaos. Through it all, Cornell stood steady, letting Geraldine's arrogance destroy her from within. But storms never build forever without breaking. Cornell knew the breaking point was coming, and when it hit, no one in Maplewood Lakes would emerge untouched. Geraldine Klein had already lost the casual support of her neighbors, but she refused, utterly refused, to show weakness. Her pride was now her prison. Pride had hardened into stubbornness. Geraldine's bluff had become a stubborn creed. The more people questioned her, the more fiercely she clung to the ground she'd tried to claim. On Thursday evening, she called a closed-door session with her inner circle at the clubhouse. Heavy drapes shut out the summer sun. The long oak table was crowded with maps, blueprints, and thick folders of legalese. She perched at the head like a general over a campaign map. "This is about control," Geraldine declared, tapping a manicured nail against the runway blueprint. "If we back down now, Maplewood Lakes becomes a laughingstock. We set the tone for this neighborhood, and no one, not even Cornell Braxton, dictates terms to us." Across the table, Travis Merriman shifted, the edge of doubt showing. "But he's not just anyone. He's the FAA director. One memo from his office," Geraldine scoffed. "He wouldn't dare. That would be abuse of power. He's bluffing." Her voice hardened. "We keep going." Evelyn Rhodes, fingers knotted, whispered, "What if he isn't bluffing? The neighbors are turning on us. I've gotten 6 emails today alone demanding we halt the project." Geraldine leaned back. Her pearl necklace flashed in the lamplight. "Then let him come. If he wants a fight, he'll get one. I will not be remembered as the president who caved to intimidation." Pride had become armor and a chain. In Washington, Cornell Braxton sat at his FAA desk, the city's skyline framed beyond the glass. He was the same man who stood chest-deep in soybean rows, black, 6 feet tall, shoulders built from years of honest farm work, wearing the quiet confidence of someone who'd earned every line on his hands. Today he wore a plain shirt and a tight jaw. There were reports stacked like small mountains before him. Franklin Yates entered with a folder and a measured knock. "Sir, FAA protocols, environmental requirements, zoning restrictions for private airstrips, it's all here, ironclad, no bypass." Cornell flipped the pages with slow care. "Good. I want her to see the wall she's running into before she smashes her head against it." He paused, then shook his head when Franklin asked if he wanted a formal investigation started. "Not yet. This has to play out locally. If I step in too soon, it'll look like I used my badge for a personal battle. But once she crosses federal territory, she'll see how small her world really is." He closed the folder, eyes cold but patient. Timing, he knew, was the weapon. That weekend, Geraldine staged a public rally on the proposed runway site. Folding chairs, banners, even catered trays. She painted the future in broad, glossy strokes. Economic growth, exclusivity, a modern Maplewood Lakes. A handful of loyalists clapped. Many more hung back, forced smiles wavering. Cornell arrived late, rolling his old pickup down the field's edge. He stepped out in his work clothes, jeans worn from the same soil his family had tended for decades, a faded work shirt, cap tucked under his arm. His presence didn't roar. It simply redirected the room's attention. Geraldine stiffened but pasted on a smile. "Mr. Braxton, I'm glad you came. Maybe now you'll finally see the community supports this project." Cornell scanned the crowd. Dozens of uneasy faces, some downcast, others searching him for courage. He spoke plainly, measured and steady. "I see neighbors afraid of fines, afraid of being bullied into silence. That isn't support. That's intimidation." Murmurs spread. Geraldine's chin lifted. "You can accuse me all you want, but the board's authority is clear." "No," Cornell cut in, voice even but unyielding. "Authority isn't license. You built your plan on shaky records and louder rhetoric. You've trespassed on private land and threatened people who had no say in your grand vision. That's not leadership. That's theft dressed up as progress." Heads turned. Some neighbors shifted closer. Others folded their arms, conflicted. Travis stood behind Geraldine, watching the scene like a man who'd just realized he had bet on the wrong horse. Geraldine tried to regain control. Rally script, talking points, the rehearsed cadence of a woman used to being believed. But the crowd no longer hung on her words the way they used to. For every person she'd rallied, another had stepped away. Cornell didn't press his federal card. He didn't need to. He let her words, her actions, and the evidence he'd quietly marshaled speak louder. His restraint, far from weakness, felt, to many, like a promise. There was more coming if she continued. By dusk, the rally had thinned into scattered conversations and the tired clink of cooling, chafing dishes. The community felt split and raw. Geraldine's public gamble had failed to rally the base she'd expected. Instead, it amplified the unease. Cornell walked the fence line before leaving, breathing in the farm's familiar smells: cut grass, turned earth, his father's barn a silhouette against a lowering sky. He touched the rail as if touching a promise. The fight would be long, and he would be deliberate. Back at the clubhouse, behind closed doors, Geraldine's resolve hardened into a dangerous kind of bravado. Outside, neighbors whispered and chose sides. Some would stand with her out of fear or habit. Others would stand with the man who had planted those fields and never sold his name for a quick profit. And Cornell, quiet, powerful, and patient, knew the next move would have to be precise enough to end the lie without breaking the neighborhood he loved. He wasn't done. He was only warming up. Pride had calcified into something uglier, stubbornness that would swallow consequence. Geraldine Klein, a woman of precise nails, pearl necklaces, immaculate tailored suits, and the kind of posture that treated every room like a stage, kept telling herself she could buy the future. She refused to see the cost. Cornell Braxton stood in front of her and the board like a living rebuke. Black, 6 feet tall, shoulders carved by a lifetime of honest labor, dark, flawless skin, eyes that held both the patient calm of a farmer and the cold precision of a federal director. He carried both identities in the same frame. He pulled a thin folder from under his arm and laid it on the clubhouse table as if it were a piece of rock. "We have the votes. We have the plan," someone tried to insist. Cornell didn't flinch. He opened the folder and let the pages speak for him. Federal statutes, FAA regulations, zoning memos, environmental rules, the legal architecture that rendered an unauthorized strip of asphalt more than an error. It made it a federal hazard. "Without FAA approval," he said, voice low but sure, "your runway is nothing more than asphalt on dirt. And let me assure you, approval will never come." Gasps skittered across the room like startled birds. Geraldine's smile thinned, then shook, but she pressed forward anyway. Pride had a way of drowning reason. "You wouldn't dare use your office to stop us. That'd be corruption," she snapped, the words a practiced lance. Cornell stepped closer, close enough that the air between them felt charged. "Corruption is when you steal land you don't own. Corruption is when you threaten families with fines to bully them into silence. Don't talk to me about corruption, Geraldine. I know it when I see it." The room hummed. Neighbors exchanged looks, some burning with anger, others relieving invalidation. For the first time, Geraldine's mask fractured. Her cheeks blazed. Composure, that carefully cultivated thing, slipped. Phones came up. People recorded, uploaded, whispered. The neighborhood watched its polished facade rip. Travis Merriman, once eager, now hollow-eyed, finally spoke. "Geraldine, he's right. We can't keep pushing. We'll destroy ourselves. This isn't leadership. It's ego." Evelyn Rhodes, who had tried to keep the board steady, looked at the crowd and out across the horizon, voice trembling but firm. "Maybe it's time we listen instead of bulldoze." Geraldine's hands clenched. She had no real answer, only a decision to double down. "We'll consult counsel," she snapped. "This matter isn't finished." Cornell gave the single nod that ended arguments. "Then I'll see you in court, and in Washington." He turned away. His words were a line drawn in the dirt, his exit deliberate. Outside the clubhouse, phones buzzed. Rosalind Braxton, Rosalind, younger sister, flour-dusted apron from the morning's bread, soft, but fierce, hands that taught Sunday school and steadied family meals, called as he climbed into his truck. "Cornell, you just cut her down in front of everyone," she breathed. "No," he said calmly, settling the cap under his arm. "She cut herself down. I just held up the mirror. But mirrors are dangerous. Pride doesn't die quietly." Geraldine would not yield. She moved into a darker gear. Within days, Maplewood Lakes lost the glossy sheen of suburban calm. Lawns stayed mown, but mornings were stiff with curt nods and side glances. The corner diner echoed with low, angry conversations. The HOA's image cracked, trust frayed. And Geraldine didn't retreat. She hired Durham attorney Victor Langley, a well-tailored man with a reputation for turning disputes into bleeding, slow court fights. At a tense Thursday meeting, she declared, flat and cold, "If Braxton thinks he can scare us, he's wrong. We'll bury him in paperwork. We'll make this so expensive he won't last." Travis rubbed his temples. "You don't understand. He's not just any farmer. He has Washington behind him. If this goes federal, we all burn." "Then let them be furious," Geraldine snapped. "Progress always upsets the small-minded." While she sharpened legal knives, Cornell sat on the farmhouse porch with Patrice Braxton. Patrice, his wife Raleigh, middle school history teacher. Chalk-smudged blouse, sometimes steady and wise, and watched his phone light up with reporters hungry for the story. FAA director versus HOA. Patrice watched him dodge calls. "You can't keep dodging them forever," she urged softly. He sighed. "The more I talk, the more it becomes a circus," she countered, voice quick with worry. "If you don't speak, Geraldine's story becomes the only story." He watched the sun dip behind the barn, his father's barn, red gone to rust but standing, and felt the weight of what silence cost. "All right," he said finally. "Maybe it's time they hear me. On the record." That Sunday evening, under lamplight and the hush of twilight, Cornell stood before a local news crew in front of the farm's weathered barn. He folded his arms across the chest that had sown and reaped this land, and he spoke plainly into the lens, voice calm and resonant for anyone watching. "This land has belonged to my family for 3 generations. It's not community property, it is not for sale, and it is certainly not the site for Maplewood Lakes runway." He let that settle, then added with quiet force, "No one gets to steal a people's history and call it progress." Cameras rolled. The clip ran on the local station and rippled out across town feeds. The story was no longer a private spat. It was public, legal, visceral, and it had teeth. The cameras had barely cooled after Cornell's barnside interview before the story spread like wildfire. "The FAA director battling his own HOA," the anchors repeated with a smirk, as clips of Geraldine's fiery speeches played beside footage of Cornell standing tall, arms folded with the Braxton farm behind him. The contrast was devastating. By dawn on Monday, talk radio hosts were dissecting the fight. Some laughed at the absurdity of an HOA challenging federal aviation law. Others seethed at the arrogance of Geraldine Rhodes, calling her the poster child of suburban overreach. Editorials filled newspapers with biting headlines. Progress or power trip? HOA hubris meets federal law. The noise rattled Maplewood Lakes. For some neighbors, it wasn't about principle anymore. It was about survival. What would happen to their property values now that their subdivision was in the national spotlight? Young families whispered about pulling out before the lawsuits tanked their savings. But for others, the fire lit by Cornell's calm defiance burned like pride. They were tired of Geraldine's bullying, and finally, someone had stood up to her. That evening, the clubhouse bulged with residents. Folding chairs scraped, voices rose, the air thick with frustration. Joan Field, the retired teacher with a voice that could silence a classroom, stood and shouted, "Geraldine, you've humiliated this neighborhood. We are on the 6 o'clock news. The 6 o'clock news. We didn't move here to become a circus." Howard Greer slammed his cane against the floor, his old eyes flashing. "You promised us growth. All we've gotten is shame. You've turned Maplewood Lakes into a punchline." Geraldine's gavel cracked like thunder. "Enough. This chaos is temporary. Once the runway is complete, the benefits will outweigh the noise." But then Cornell rose. He hadn't spoken all night, sitting quietly in the back like a shadow waiting for its moment. His voice cut across the uproar like a blade. "Runway," he said, steady and low. "You're not building a runway, Geraldine. You're building a liability, and the FAA does not authorize liabilities." Gasps rippled. Victor Langley, Geraldine's slick attorney in his tailored suit, sprang up like a cornered fox. "Mr. Braxton, you may be the FAA director in Washington, but here you are just a landowner. You cannot use your office to strangle community development." Cornell squared his shoulders, his eyes narrowing. "You're right. I can't use my office for personal gain, but I can enforce federal aviation law, and I will. Every last letter of it." The room erupted. Applause, shouts, chaos. Phones shot into the air to record it all. Half the neighbors demanded Geraldine's resignation on the spot. Others, desperate to save face, clung to her promises like driftwood in a storm. The board splintered, the facade of unity shattered before the cameras and whispers. That night, Geraldine drove alone through Maplewood Lakes, headlights slicing the dark. Every window she passed felt like an accusation. Families she once ruled over now closed their curtains, their silence louder than jeers. For the first time in years, doubt wormed its way into her perfect composure. Her allies were fading. Her reputation tattered. The man she had underestimated, lionized. Back on the Braxton farm, Cornell sat on the porch with Rosalind and Patrice, the cicadas loud in the thick night air. Rosalind leaned forward, worry plain on her face. "You've pushed her into a corner. What do you think she'll do now?" Cornell sipped his sweet tea slowly, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "A cornered ego," he said, "is the most dangerous kind. She'll lash out before she admits she's wrong." Neither Rosalind nor Patrice knew just how right he was, because Geraldine Rhodes was not finished. By midweek, her grip on the community crumbled to ash. At the playground, parents whispered about moving out. At the diner, residents signed petitions demanding her resignation. Even Evelyn Rhodes, once her most loyal ally, confided to neighbors she was done being dragged through the mud. And yet, Geraldine refused to fold. On Wednesday morning, the low growl of diesel engines shattered the stillness of Maplewood Lakes. Heavy trucks rolled toward the Braxton farm, their headlights glaring like intruders at dawn. Gravel spilled from their beds in heaps, machinery roared to life, and steel teeth began tearing into the soil. She had ordered the contractor forward, even without approval. The neighborhood watched in disbelief, but this time they weren't silent. They gathered at the property line, a wall of bodies with homemade signs. "Respect the Braxtons." "No runway on stolen land." The voices rose, angry, determined. Cornell stepped out of his farmhouse slowly, calm as ever. His boots crunched against the gravel as he walked directly toward the machines. The crowd parted to watch, and the standoff that had been brewing for months was about to explode. Cornell stepped into the path of the roaring machines, his hand rising like a signal flare. "Shut it down." The foreman froze, sweat already streaking his temple. His eyes flicked from the idling bulldozer to the man blocking its path. "Mr. Braxton, I've got instructions from the HOA." Cornell cut him off, his voice calm but steel-edged. From his jacket, he pulled a folded paper and snapped it open. "And I've got a federal injunction, effective today. Any further construction here is illegal under FAA law. You keep those machines running, and you'll answer not to Maplewood Lakes, but to Washington, D.C. The foreman stared at the seal on the document, then at Cornell's steady gaze. His Adam's apple bobbed. Finally, with a slow wave of his arm, the engines sputtered quiet. One by one, the machines shut down. For a heartbeat, silence blanketed the field. Then gasps, then cheers. Angela Rowe clapped through tears, her voice breaking as she shouted, "Finally!" Applause erupted, neighbors surging with relief and vindication. That's when Geraldine's black SUV came tearing down the gravel road, tires spitting dust. The vehicle screeched to a halt, and she stormed out, her fury so sharp it seemed to crack the air itself. "You think you've won, Cornell? You think this piece of paper scares me?" Cornell didn't flinch. His voice stayed even, rooted like the land beneath his boots. "It's not about fear, Geraldine. It's about law. And you've broken it." Her lips curled, eyes flashing. "You're abusing your power." Cornell's reply cut clean and final. "No, I'm defending my family, and I'm defending every neighbor you tried to bully. That's the difference." The crowd roared again, this time louder, stronger. Chants swelled in the humid air. "Step down, step down!" Geraldine's composure cracked, her voice trembling as she shouted back. But the sound of her words was drowned in the tide of voices rising against her. Travis Merriman and Evelyn Rhodes broke from the crowd, their faces pale with defeat. Evelyn leaned close to Geraldine, her whisper sharp with urgency. "It's over. If we keep pushing, we'll bankrupt ourselves. The community's against us." Travis added, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "You wanted a legacy? Well, here it is. You'll be remembered for tearing this neighborhood apart." For the first time, Geraldine Rhodes had no retort. She looked around, the angry eyes, the machines idle. The man she had mocked now standing unshaken with the law on his side. Pride had carried her this far, but now it left her stranded, exposed. Without a word, she spun on her heel and stormed back to her SUV. The door slammed, gravel spitting beneath her tires as she sped away, her empire crumbling in the rearview mirror. The following week, the collapse was complete. Under mounting pressure, the HOA board dissolved. Geraldine resigned, her attorney Victor Langley slipping quietly away when the case revealed itself to be baseless. County officials confirmed what Cornell always knew. The Braxton family's deed was ironclad. The attempted seizure had been illegal from the very beginning. Relief swept through Maplewood Lakes like a cleansing rain. At the diner, conversation shifted back to ordinary life. Children played again without tension weighing on their parents' shoulders. At Sunday service, gratitude filled St. Mark's pews where gossip once lingered. But for Cornell, victory was not about headlines or authority. One golden evening, he walked the fields with Anthony by his side. The soil still bore scars from machinery, but it was theirs, untouched, unbroken. Anthony finally asked the question that had been burning inside him. "Dad, you could have crushed her from the beginning. Why'd you wait?" Cornell paused, resting a strong hand on his son's shoulder. "Because sometimes the hardest lesson isn't the one you teach. It's the one people teach themselves." Geraldine needed to fall by her own hand, so everyone could see what arrogance does. Anthony nodded slowly, understanding. Rosalind joined them, brushing her hands against the tall grass. Her voice carried the wisdom of both witness and survivor. "Your daddy's right. This land has stood through storms before. It'll stand through this one too." Cornell smiled faintly, his eyes lifting to the horizon as the sun dipped low. "This land isn't just soil, son. It's legacy. And legacy doesn't bend to greed." The wind rustled through the fields, carrying the sound of children's laughter in the distance. Maplewood Lakes was at peace again, But the lesson lingered, carved deep into its history. Communities survive on integrity, not intimidation. And legacy will always outlast arrogance. Power, humility, and the cost of forgetting that respect is stronger than pride. Life in Maplewood Lakes slowly found its balance again, but the scars of the fight lingered like tracks in freshly tilled soil. Some residents felt embarrassed by how close they had come to losing themselves in Geraldine's vision. Others felt humbled, realizing they had allowed fear of property values and social standing to blind them to what was right. For Cornell Braxton, the outcome confirmed what he had always known. Patience, dignity, and truth outlast arrogance every time. Weeks after Geraldine's resignation, a community gathering was held, not in the clubhouse that had once been her stage, but at St. Mark's Church. The pews were full, neighbors sitting side by side without the thick tension that had once divided them. At the front, the new interim board spoke briefly about rebuilding trust, then stepped aside to let Cornell speak. He walked up slowly, no papers in his hand, no titles hanging from his shoulders, just a man in a simple shirt, his cap tucked under his arm. He looked out over the faces of the people who had lived through the storm with him, families, retirees, children sitting on laps, and began, "This fight was never about me, and it wasn't just about land. It was about respect. Respect for history, respect for hard work, respect for your neighbors. Somewhere along the way, that respect got lost, and when it's lost, we all pay the price." The words hung heavy in the sanctuary. You saw what happened when pride and power tried to take something that did not belong to them. It tore us apart. It brought lawyers, cameras, shame. But in the end, it taught us something we needed to remember. Progress without respect isn't progress. It's destruction. Angela Rowe nodded slowly from the front row. Howard Greer leaned on his cane, his weathered face showing both exhaustion and relief. Even Travis Merriman, once Geraldine's loyal ally, stared at the floor, the weight of guilt pressing on his silence. Cornell's voice carried steady. "I could have used my position to end this quickly, but I didn't. Because if I had, you might never have seen the truth for yourselves. Geraldine wasn't just fighting me. She was fighting every one of you. She believed power made her untouchable. But she forgot communities don't survive on power. They survive on respect, humility, and accountability." Patrice sat beside Rosalind, her eyes wet. She knew this wasn't just about Maplewood Lakes. Cornell was speaking to something deeper, something every community, every family, every person needed to hear. "And I hope," Cornell said, his tone firm but calm, "that when the next test comes, and it will, you'll remember what happened here. Don't let fear or greed blind you. Don't let pride make you forget who you are. Stand on truth even when it costs you something, because the cost of silence is always greater." The church was silent except for the creak of wooden pews as people shifted uncomfortably. Then, slowly, applause began. Not loud, not rushed. Steady, growing, until the room filled with it. Cornell nodded once, then stepped down, returning to his seat beside Patrice. Outside, neighbors lingered in the churchyard. Conversations felt lighter. Children chased each other across the grass, and for the first time in months, laughter carried freely through the air. In the distance, the Braxton farm stood quiet but resolute, a living reminder of what had been fought for. Not just land, but legacy. Later that evening, Cornell sat on the porch with Patrice, fireflies flickering against the twilight. "You think they'll remember?" Patrice asked softly. "They'll remember," Cornell said. "People always remember when pride costs them. And if they don't, well, history has a way of teaching the same lesson twice." Patrice smiled faintly. "And you? What did you learn?" Cornell leaned back, his eyes sweeping across the fields. "That sometimes the hardest battles aren't in Washington or a courtroom. They're in your own backyard. And if you can win those with patience and dignity, you can win anything." The farm was quiet. the soil safe again. But the lesson would live far beyond Maplewood Lakes. Because in the end, the story wasn't just about a man protecting his land. It was about what happens when arrogance collides with truth, when privilege is forced to face accountability, and when neighbors remember that real progress isn't built on runways, it's built on respect. If this story spoke to you, don't forget to subscribe. Because the strongest legacies are not built on power but on principle. Fate Tales.